You know, I remember when my father used to tell me, "Son, the test of a country isn't when times are good, it's when the lights go out." And I can't help but think of that now, not here in America, but across the Atlantic, in Britain. Once the workshop of the world, the land that built the engines, the ships, the machines that carried civilization forward, is now watching those lights dim. And the question that echoes, not just for them, but for us, is what happens when a nation forgets how to make things? Let's take a walk through what's really happening, not to judge, but to understand what Britain's collapse is telling us about the world we all built. From Manchester's mills to Sheffield's foundries, made in Britain used to mean something. I'm talking about real things: locomotives, steel girders, fine china that grace dining rooms across continents. These weren't just products, they were promises. Promises of craftsmanship, durability, and national pride. But today the hum of those machines has been replaced by silence. An eerie, unsettling quiet that settles over towns that once rang with purpose. The automotive plants that employed generations of families are shuttering their doors. Car production has fallen by more than a third in recent periods, hitting lows not seen since the early 1950s. Think about that for a moment. These are factories that survived the Blitz. They weathered the economic storms of the 1970s. They adapted through recessions and recoveries. And yet, they couldn't survive their own government's policies. Now, I want to be clear here. This isn't about politics in the partisan sense. This is about choices, about what happens when a nation decides to pursue a vision without building the infrastructure to support it. Britain's leadership became fixated on achieving what they called net zero emissions. A noble goal, certainly. Who among us doesn't want cleaner air for our grandchildren? But here's where the tragedy unfolds. They pursued this goal without first ensuring that energy, the absolute lifeblood of any industrial economy, remained affordable and reliable. The result? British factories now face energy costs that are double what their French competitors pay. Double. And compared to American manufacturers, 4 times as much. Let that sink in for a moment. If you're running a ceramics plant, a tire factory, or an automotive assembly line, and your energy bill is 4 times what your competitor across the ocean pays, what choice do you have? You have no choice. You either close down or you move. And they're moving. Pirelli, that iconic tire manufacturer, shut 2 facilities. Wedgwood, one of Britain's most treasured names in fine ceramics, a brand that represented British quality for generations, was forced to completely halt production for 3 straight months, not to retool, not to modernize, but simply to stop the financial bleeding, and it gets worse. On top of these astronomical energy costs, the British government made another decision that historians will likely puzzle over for decades. On the first day of 2023, they cut themselves off entirely from Russian energy supplies. Now, I'm not here to debate the geopolitical complexities of that choice. But economically, it was like cutting off your own leg to spite your foot. Germany made the same choice. And now you have Europe's 2 largest industrial powers having deliberately severed their own energy lifelines. The consequences were predictable and devastating. It's one thing to make a principled stand. It's another to do so without having secured alternative supplies at comparable costs. And Britain didn't. But the energy crisis is only part of the story. Because while factories were struggling to keep the lights on, the government piled on. A relentless series of new taxes and fees, all landing squarely on the shoulders of manufacturers, higher national insurance contributions for employers, punitive carbon levies, soaring landfill charges. Each one, taken individually, might seem reasonable, but together they sent an unmistakable message. Britain doesn't want you making things here anymore. And the manufacturers heard that message loud and clear. Now, here's what troubles me most about this industrial collapse. It's not just about factory closures or production statistics. It's about the human beings behind those numbers. Tens of thousands of skilled workers, people who'd spent their entire lives mastering their trades, who'd raised families on those wages, who'd taken pride in building real things, suddenly found themselves adrift. These weren't just jobs, they were identities. A toolmaker in Birmingham, a welder in Newcastle, a ceramics specialist whose family had worked the same kiln for 3 generations. When that factory closes, it doesn't just disappear. It takes with it the accumulated knowledge of decades, the intricate supply chains that took generations to build, the sense of community and shared purpose that gave those towns meaning. And here's the cruel arithmetic of industrial decline. Once it's gone, it almost never comes back. The workers, out of necessity, move on to other fields or other countries. The suppliers dissolve, the expertise evaporates. The markets get ceded to foreign competitors who don't face such punitive domestic policies. It's not like closing a store and reopening it next year. It's more like watching a coral reef die. Once the ecosystem collapses, you can't just pour water back and expect it to revive. Perhaps the most bewildering aspect of this entire crisis is the sheer indifference from the political class. While the nation's industrial heartland is being systematically dismantled, there's no urgency in the halls of power, no emergency task forces, no recognition that this is a national crisis in the making. And yet, and this is what really gets me, while British factories go dark, the UK government proudly announces more than £20 billion in commitments to Ukraine. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not arguing about the merits of supporting Ukraine. That's a separate conversation. What I'm pointing out is the priorities. There appears to be no comprehensive plan to revive domestic production, to save the industries that built modern Britain. But there's seemingly endless capacity to fund initiatives abroad. It's a pattern we're familiar with here in America, isn't it? We've watched our own industrial base hollow out over decades. We've seen factory towns in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan transform from bustling centers of production into struggling communities searching for new identities. So, when I look at what's happening in Britain, I don't see it as a foreign story. I see it as a warning. Because here's the hard truth. The rest of the world isn't waiting. While Britain willingly walks into what some are calling an industrial graveyard, other nations are surging forward. China continues its relentless expansion of manufacturing dominance. Countries like India and Vietnam are rapidly industrializing, becoming the new powerhouses of global production. If Britain ever finds the political will to reverse course, and that's a big if, they'll be trying to re-enter a market that's infinitely more competitive, more sophisticated, and more ruthless than the one they left. And this brings us to the second act of this tragedy. Because the industrial collapse hasn't happened in isolation, it's exposed something even more frightening: the fragility of Britain's entire economic foundation. For decades, Britain managed to maintain an illusion of prosperity. Even as the factories closed and the shipyards went silent, the economy seemed to hum along. How? Through finance, through banking, through an ever-expanding service sector built on managing money, moving capital, and trading in abstractions. For a while, quite a long while actually, it worked. London became one of the world's great financial centers. Gleaming towers full of bankers and traders replaced the grimy factories as the symbols of British economic might. The thinking was simple. We don't need to make things anymore. We're a post-industrial economy now. We manage wealth. We provide services. But here's what they forgot. Here's what always gets forgotten in these transitions. You can't eat spreadsheets. You can't live in a derivative. And when the numbers on the screen are no longer backed by a real economy, an economy that actually makes things, grows things, builds things, those numbers start to lose their meaning. And that's exactly what's happening now. Britain's national debt has exploded to nearly £3 trillion. Now, I know that's a number so large it's almost meaningless to our minds. So, let me put it another way. The United Kingdom now owes more money than its entire economy produces in a year. Every penny earned by every British citizen, every business, every transaction, all of it combined, still doesn't equal what the nation owes. The debt-to-GDP ratio has breached 100%, and it's not slowing down. Every single month, the debt pile grows by roughly £17 billion. That's not a one-time shock from a pandemic or a war. That's structural. That's what happens when a government consistently spends far more than it takes in, year after year after year. If you divide that total debt by every man, woman, and child in the UK, it works out to roughly £41,000 per person. Imagine that. Every baby born in Britain enters the world already owing the equivalent of about $50,000 in American currency. But even that's not the worst of it. For years, this massive debt burden was manageable because money was essentially free. Interest rates were at historic lows, sometimes barely above zero. Britain could borrow unlimited amounts and barely feel the pain. But that era has ended, abruptly, violently. The cost of borrowing for the UK government has shot up to 27-year highs, the highest since 1998. And when you're sitting on £3 trillion of debt, even small increases in interest rates become catastrophic. Britain now spends over £100 billion per year, just paying the interest on its existing debt, not paying down the debt itself, just the interest. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire national defense budget. It's nearly as much as the whole education system. Think about that. £100 billion a year that could be rebuilding hospitals, training nurses, repairing roads, investing in research and development. Instead, it's being shipped directly to bondholders and creditors just to service old debts. This is what economists call the crowding out effect. And we're watching it happen in real time. And when you're spending that kind of money just to keep your head above water, something else starts to break, something deeper. Something that goes to the very heart of what a nation is supposed to do for its people. You see, this isn't just an abstract financial crisis playing out on trading screens in London. This has metastasized into something ordinary British citizens feel every single day. It's in the hospital waiting rooms. It's in the potholes they drive over. It's in the libraries that are closing their doors forever. Let me tell you about the National Health Service, the NHS. For those of us who remember the post-war era, the NHS represented something profound. It was Britain's promise to its people that healthcare wouldn't be a privilege of wealth, but a right of citizenship. It was a beacon of civilized society. And for decades, it worked. Not perfectly, nothing ever does, but it worked. But today, the NHS is crumbling, and I don't use that word lightly. Waiting lists have swollen into the millions. Not thousands, millions. People waiting in pain, sometimes for years, for essential surgeries. Accident and emergency departments that have become scenes of barely controlled chaos, with patients waiting 12 hours or more on hallway gurneys because there simply aren't enough beds, enough staff, enough resources. The physical buildings themselves are literally falling apart. Hospitals propped up by temporary supports, leaking roofs, failing equipment that should have been replaced a decade ago. This isn't a temporary funding squeeze. This is what systemic starvation looks like. And here's the bitter irony. There's money in Britain, plenty of it actually. It's just that £100 billion a year is being siphoned off to pay interest on old debts instead of being invested in the present and future. So nurses work double shifts until they burn out. Patients suffer, and the two-tier system emerges. Private health care for those who can afford it, and a deteriorating public system for everyone else. The very principle the NHS was built upon is being quietly abandoned, not through deliberate policy, but through financial exhaustion. And it's not just healthcare. Drive down any British road and you'll encounter what's become a national metaphor: potholes, everywhere. Not because British engineers forgot how to make roads, but because there's no money left to maintain them. The rail network, the very technology Britain gave to the world, has become an international embarrassment. Chronic delays, endless strikes, exorbitant ticket prices for deteriorating service. Long-term infrastructure projects like HS2, the high-speed rail line meant to connect the country and bridge regional economic divides, have been scaled back or canceled entirely. Billions already spent, nothing to show for it, and the infrastructure gap only widening. But perhaps the most heartbreaking collapse is happening at the local level. Town councils, the entities responsible for the fabric of daily community life, are declaring bankruptcy one after another. Major cities like Birmingham and Nottingham have issued what's called Section 114 notices. That's the formal admission that they can no longer meet their financial obligations. And what does that mean in practice? It means libraries closing, parks falling into disrepair, social care for the elderly and vulnerable being rationed to the point of cruelty. Even basic services like street cleaning and waste collection are being cut or eliminated. This is the hollowing out of civil society itself. I think about the communities I've visited over the years, here in America, that have gone through similar transformations. When the heart of a town, Its gathering places, its services, its sense of shared purpose disappears. Something intangible but essential dies with it. People become isolated, angry, despairing. Even Britain's justice system is buckling under the weight. Courts are crumbling. Case backlogs have swollen to unmanageable levels. Victims waiting. Years for their cases to be heard. The accused are stuck in limbo, sometimes in pretrial detention, because the system simply cannot process cases fast enough. When justice is delayed to that extent, it ceases to be justice at all. And when people lose faith in the basic institutions that hold society together, healthcare, infrastructure, courts, local services, that's when the real crisis begins. Because what we're really talking about here is a broken social contract. The fundamental understanding that citizens pay taxes in exchange for functional public services. When taxes are at record highs, but services are visibly deteriorating before people's eyes, that contract shatters. And once trust is lost, it's extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The British public, already squeezed by the worst cost of living crisis in memory, relying on food banks in numbers that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, watches as their record-high taxes disappear into what feels like a black hole. So you'd think, with all of this happening, with the industrial base dying, the debt spiraling, the public services collapsing, you'd expect a robust government response, a comprehensive plan, emergency measures, something. But that brings us to perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this entire crisis: the complete political paralysis. The government knows the house is burning. They can smell the smoke, but they're frozen, trapped in what some analysts are calling an impossible trilemma. 3 theoretical options, each one politically suicidal. Let me walk you through it, because I think it tells us something important about governance in our modern age. Option 1, cut spending. In theory, if you're spending far more than you're taking in, you reduce spending until the budget balances. Simple arithmetic, right? But in practice, political poison. Any serious attempt to cut spending enough to actually matter would mean taking an axe to the sacred cows. The NHS, which is already perceived as collapsing, or the pension system, which guarantees benefits rise with inflation. After years of austerity and crumbling services, the public already feels the country is broken. Further cuts would trigger a political rebellion that would end any government overnight. Option 2, raise taxes. Also politically toxic. Both major parties have painted themselves into a corner by promising not to raise the 3 main taxes: income tax, national insurance, and VAT. Households are already suffering under the worst cost of living crisis in living memory. Real wages have been essentially stagnant for nearly 2 decades. Raising taxes on middle earners to pay for an even larger state would be seen as a profound betrayal. And the alternative, a soak-the-rich approach, is a fantasy. Confiscatory taxes on the wealthy wouldn't raise nearly enough to fix the structural deficit. It would just accelerate the capital flight that's already happening, with millionaires and high earners leaving the UK in increasing numbers. Which brings us to option 3, print money. The government could, in effect, force the Bank of England to create new money out of thin air to buy up government debt and finance the deficit. This is what's called quantitative easing, and they've done it before. But doing it now, in this environment, it would be a catastrophic admission of failure. It would pour gasoline on the very inflation the central bank is desperately trying to control. More importantly, it would instantly destroy what little remains of international investor confidence. The pound would spiral, borrowing costs would hyperinflate. It would be the sign that Britain has resorted to the desperate measures of a failing state. So, there you have it, 3 options, all blocked. And when a government can't cut spending, can't raise taxes, and can't print money without triggering a crisis, what's left? Nothing. Paralysis. The slow drift toward what some economists are calling a stagnation trap. Not a dramatic crash like 1976, when Britain had to go hat in hand to the International Monetary Fund, but something arguably worse. A long, grinding decline in living standards, stagnant wages, crumbling services. Each budget is a desperate scramble to find a few billion here and there, while the structural rot deepens. And you know who pays the highest price for this? Britain's young people, an entire generation facing a broken promise. where home ownership, something their parents and grandparents took for granted, has become an impossible dream, where real wage growth is a distant memory, where the future looks dimmer than the past. I think about my own grandchildren here in America, and I wonder if we're watching our own future play out across the Atlantic. Because Britain's crisis isn't happening in a vacuum, we have our own massive debt, our own infrastructure is crumbling, our own political system that seems increasingly incapable of addressing long-term challenges. The parallels are uncomfortable. Britain's story isn't foreign. It's a mirror, just a few years ahead of us perhaps, but a mirror nonetheless. And that brings me to something that's been troubling me. How does a nation end up repeating history like this? Britain has been through this before. The 1970s, the oil shocks, double-digit inflation, interest rates at 15%, the humiliation of the IMF bailout in 1976. They recovered from that. It was painful, it was difficult, but they recovered. So why are they back here again? Is it pride, politics, or just collective denial? I think part of the answer lies in something we've all experienced, the illusion of prosperity. For more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, money was essentially free, interest rates near zero. Governments could borrow unlimited amounts and barely feel the cost. It created a false sense of security. Everyone felt rich. Housing prices soared. Governments spent freely. People borrowed against their futures. But prosperity built on free money isn't real prosperity. It's a mirage. And when interest rates rise, as they inevitably must, that mirage evaporates, and you're left staring at the harsh reality of what you actually built. Britain built a financial house of cards on top of a hollowed-out real economy. And now, the wind is blowing. Some analysts have reached a counterintuitive and deeply disturbing conclusion that the worst-case scenario isn't actually a crash, but the absence of one. They argue that only a sharp, sudden financial crisis would be powerful enough to break through the political paralysis. That only a real emergency would force the difficult, adult conversation with the public about what the state can realistically provide and what citizens are truly willing to pay for. Without that reckoning, Britain is condemned to a generation of stagnation, a slow fade into irrelevance, haunted by the ghosts of the industries it abandoned, crushed by the weight of debts it can never fully repay. It's a grim prognosis, and sitting here, watching it unfold, I can't help but think about what my father told me all those years ago. The test of a country isn't when times are good, it's when the lights go out. Britain's lights are dimming, not because they lack the knowledge or the people or the resources to keep them on, but because of choices, policy choices, political choices, the choice to pursue green energy without ensuring energy security, the choice to let an industrial base die without a plan to replace it, the choice to borrow against tomorrow without asking what tomorrow would demand in return. And here's what keeps me up at night. We're not so different. America has its own vulnerabilities, our own debt approaching $35 trillion, our own infrastructure rated D+ by engineers, our own political system paralyzed by partisanship and short-term thinking. The British story should be a warning, not entertainment. Because the hard truth is this: democracy, prosperity, stability, none of these are guaranteed. They're not permanent features of the landscape. They're maintained by choices, by investments, by citizens who pay attention and demand accountability. And when we stop maintaining them, when we take them for granted, they slip away. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. So, if this story has made you think, if you see some of these echoes in our own backyard, I'd ask you to do something. Don't just watch. Don't just worry. Engage. Talk about these things with your family, your friends, your community, because these aren't just Britain's crossroads. They're ours too. If you found this reflection valuable, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and more importantly, tell me what you see coming. Leave a comment. Share your own observations. Because the wisdom in this room, your experiences, your memories of how things used to work, your perspective on how we got here, that wisdom matters. We built the world we're living in, and maybe, just maybe, we can help steer it towards something better. Thanks for walking through this with me today. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.